Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Hi, I'm Crwaford. I'm chairman of the oceanography department here at Humboldt State University, and I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you about what's going on with ocean observing systems in the global Earth and around the country and here at Humboldt State University. So I've titled my talk, It's a Small Ocean World, or Small World Ocean After All, or Better Ocean Management Through Science. By way of an outline, what I'd like to be able to do here is to talk about some of the issues that are affecting the oceans, and in fact the planet. Then I'll talk a little bit about what's going on around the world to try to solve some of these problems, and I'll talk specifically about how things are operating here in Humboldt County in Northern California as an example of what's happening around the world. To begin with, just a reminder that the world is covered by water. About 2/3 of the surface, a little bit more than 2/3, is covered by water. A lot of land masses, a lot of atmosphere, but a lot of ocean as well. There are, as a consequence, a lot of issues that come along that affect the oceans and affect people and affect the environment. Here's a picture that shows pollution coming out of a small sewage plant. Here's another example, just reminding you that when we are working with ports where people are doing industrial development, we actually have impacts to the environment, and there are some issues associated with how are we changing the environment there? Are we creating more sedimentation because we built a pier? Those can be considered to be local issues. On the regional scale, you've got things happening like, here's a picture of Hurricane Katrina, causing a lot of damage. These hurricanes are an atmospheric phenomenon, but they are also fueled by the temperatures in the oceans, by the heat in the ocean supplies the energy that drives these hurricanes. They affect the coastlines. They affect the people that live along the coastlines. These hurricanes actually then propagate over the continental U.S. and impact people further inland with torrential rains. Another example of regional issues is harmful algal blooms. You may or may not know that we have algae that grows out in the oceans, and some of those algae are toxic. And if they are accumulated in high enough concentrations, they can really cause health problems. Here's a map for southern and central California showing the relative populations of specific toxic algae and where they're located. There are global issues that affect the oceans and that the oceans affect. That includes carbon dioxide. Many of you know about global climate change, the increase in greenhouse gases. And here is a recent picture of some of the observations, the long-term time series that's been observed at Mauna Loa on Hawaii, showing the increase in carbon dioxide. There is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's a greenhouse gas that's believed to be creating global climate change. We're seeing reductions in the ice cover in the Arctic. This is presumably leading to sea level rise, and there are more and more measurements that are indicating, as this picture here shows, that the sea level is rising globally. The important thing to remember, whether we're talking about local, regional, global issues, is that the ocean is one big ocean. It's one big body of water. It's an artificial construct to think of the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean as really being separate bodies of water. It really is one big ocean, and in fact the whole world is coupled in very complex but very important ways. So there's a whole bunch of different issues to wrestle with. Many of them are interconnected. How do we do it? Well, there is work that's going on, but a lot of people have come across the phrase, think globally, act locally. I think you need to revise that when you're talking about these global and regional issues. Think globally, regionally, and locally, and act accordingly. You can't just think about the small scale. You can't just think about the large scale. There's an interconnectedness among all of these things, and it makes no sense to think only at one scale. Likewise, there's temporal issues. You need to think about short-term variability. You need to think about short-term impacts. You also need to think about long-term impacts. Global climate change is, for the most part, a long-term impact. Some of the pollution issues that we see, for example, let's say you have some watershed that's highly concentrated in pollutants. You get a big rainstorm, it flushes all these pollutants into the ocean. That could be a short-term effect. It may have long-term consequences. You want to think about the short-term. You want to think about the long-term. Well, there is work that's going on the international front trying to get a handle on all of these different kinds of problems. A lot of it's being led by the United Nations and the representative nations within that body, and in particular UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization that is under the umbrella of the United Nations. What's happening internationally is an effort to try to get measurements and observations and models from around the world. And they're thinking about this from the perspective of the climate. They're thinking about this from the perspective of terrestrial measurements, what's happening on land where a lot of people live, and they're thinking about this from the perspective of the oceans. In this picture you see an example on the left here of how the United Nations is really thinking about breaking up the world into subgroups. There's really nations working in regional groups here. Down here in the lower right-hand corner is a picture from last January where the United Nations had basically tried to put together all of the different resources, all the different assets in the ocean around the world to try to get a sense of where are we making measurements regularly, routinely, to help us understand what's happening on the whole global level. In the ocean, we talk about this effort in terms of ocean observing systems. What might these ocean observing systems look like? Well, there's work going on, but they're not all completed. There's still a lot of development that's happening right now. Here's an idea of what one of these ocean observing systems might look like. This is from a study that was done at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, showing you the kinds of observations that might be made for an ocean observing system. It would include things like ships, like measurements from buoys, autonomous vehicles that can float underwater, either propelled with engines or gliding underwater. We can have shoreline-based radar systems that can make measurements of ocean surface currents. We can be flying airplanes and helicopters that can remotely sense things about the world's oceans. So this is kind of, in one particular location, what an ocean observing system, a complex one, mind you, might look like. These kind of efforts are happening internationally. They're happening in the United States as well. Here in the US, the effort's being carried forward under the name the Integrated Ocean Observing System, or IOOS. And again, here's sort of a symbolic representation of kind of measurements that might be made on a national level. IOOS has defined 7 specific kinds of fundamental goals that they're trying to address, sometimes nicknamed the 7 dwarves. The things of interest here are climate variability, trying to observe climate variability, not just climate change. There are quite natural variations in climate around the world. Marine operations, not exactly a crisis, but there are things that happen in the ocean that are dangerous. It's one of the most dangerous environments to work in. If any job in the world, being a fisherman is probably one of the most dangerous. So we want to be able to predict weather conditions. We want to be able to predict wave hazards. We want to be able to figure out if there's going to be an oil spill in some port, where's that going to go? We want to be able to avoid having ships collide into each other, just like we want to be able to have airplanes avoid colliding into each other. National security is also an issue here, and trying to make sure that our ports are safe is an important ingredient in trying to do ocean observing. A lot of the nation's economy revolves around the coastline, from transportation and fishing to recreation. Economic consequences of beach closures is very substantial. So we want to be able to make sure that we are making the kind of measurements in the ocean that will help us to keep our economic uses of the coastal oceans sustainable for the long term. At the same time, and sometimes in conflict with that, we want to be able to maintain healthy marine ecosystems. We want to have sustainable economic use, but we also want to make sure that our biosystem is healthy. And finally, we want to be able to try to mitigate as much as we can against natural hazards. There are things, again, that happen quite naturally in the ocean. For example, erosion. If we have, if you live in Southern California, you know about erosion if you've got a cliffside, expensive house. So how can we mitigate against some of these issues? Well, for example, when an El Nino year occurs, we have a lot of excess rain down in Southern California. So what we'd like to be able to do is predict when El Ninos are going to occur, predict when we're going to have severe rain conditions in Southern California, and then be able to try to take action to help prepare for increased rainfall and increased erosion rates. One more, public health. Public health is an issue. I mentioned these toxic algal blooms that happen in the ocean. That can lead to things like fish kills. That can lead to things like shellfish poisoning. Shellfish can accumulate a lot of the toxins from these very tiny organisms. And if you eat shellfish that are tainted, there are a number of serious consequences that can occur. So ocean observing systems are really trying to do a lot of different things. They're trying to address a number of different societal and ecosystem-based issues here. These efforts to do ocean observing systems and help provide information for management are also occurring in a regional scale. Locally, we have a number of different regional associations. These are consortia of state agencies, federal agencies, academic institutions, businesses, and public interest groups, trying to get together and trying to figure out what things we need to be observing and forecasting and how we're going to do it. All of these different regional associations around the nation are working together with the national and the international bodies to try to make sure that whatever we're doing locally gets fed upwards so that the information is readily available to others. Likewise, things that are happening at the international and national scales need to work their way down towards the regional associations so that they can take best advantage, again, of the measurements and forecasts that are being generated. Finally, ocean observing is happening locally, and that's really the main thrust of my talk here. I want to talk about some of the kinds of things that are happening in our particular neck of the woods here in Humboldt County in coastal, rural, northern California. So here along the true north coast of California, some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are associated with coastal and estuary and habitat assessment. I want to talk a little bit about some of the water quality monitoring efforts that we're undertaking here. I'm going to talk about some of the development of techniques to measure and monitor ocean currents in real time. I'll talk a little bit about coastal ocean climate measurements and ecosystem health, and talk about some wave hazard predictions as well. The first topic I'd like to tackle right now has to do with water quality and also habitat mapping. There is a group of California State University campuses, and they are working together to try to make water quality measurements and to try to be able to map what the habitat is like along our coastal oceans, particularly in important areas. Here's a list of the different institutions that are involved, and then the red or the yellow and green dots indicate where we have water quality measuring devices sitting in the water, and also where we have some additional meteorological stations that are telling us something about the atmospheric forcing that's going on in those locations. Some of the efforts that are being undertaken right now involve mapping what the bottom of the ocean looks like. So this is the topography of the bottom of the ocean. There's been a lot of measurements in the past, particularly out in the coastal and deep oceans, maybe not as much measurements as we'd like to have. Not a lot in the very near shore. Some of the work that's going on, even locally, is being undertaken by colleagues at CSU Monterey Bay, Rick Vitek and company with the C4 Mapping Lab. They have specialized remote sensing instruments that work off boats that can actually create maps of the bottom of the ocean. Another technology that we use is called hyperspectral imaging. This is a device that looks down. It's flown from an airplane, and it measures light coming off the ground, light coming off the water, and it measures it in very detailed ways. For example, we're looking at very narrow bands of wavelengths, so we get very, very detailed images of the color of the ground or the color of the ocean, whatever you're looking at. From that information, we can actually determine a lot about the nature of the materials underneath the plane. So we're using this, for example, these instruments to try to make maps of what the bottom of the ocean looks like and what kind of ground cover might be there. So here's a map that shows the depth map of the Humboldt Bay. You see the blue colored regions indicate the areas where there are navigation channels. The lighter green color indicates where there are mudflats in Humboldt Bay. It's a fairly large bay. It's the second largest bay estuary in Humboldt in California. Most of the oysters that are grown in California come from this area. There's a lot of eelgrass, which is a very important nursery for a lot of larvae that grow up in these estuaries. So the Humboldt Bay turns out to be a very important natural estuary, a natural preserve, if you will, a natural growing place for a lot of the biology that ends up living in the coastal oceans. Some of the technology I showed you earlier has been used to help create maps of eelgrass. Now, it's really hard to get out there on the ground and count every blade of eelgrass. But the technology here from airplanes, as well as some ground truthing with getting out in the field, helps us to be able to create maps like this that can indicate where the eelgrass is. On top of this map of where eelgrass is, which is given by the darker green colors, the lighter green colors indicate where we think that eelgrass might be able to grow. There's been a lot of changes in Humboldt Bay over the years in terms of what the environment's like, and there's a lot of interest locally in trying to restore some of the habitat to its prior conditions. So there's a lot of interest in, can we add more eelgrass? If so, where should we be able to add it? It turns out that when people have tried these efforts in the past, sometimes the replanted eelgrass gets washed away because they haven't really thought about some of the physical or chemical or biological consequences. For example, there are places around the bay that are not good places to plant eelgrass because the wave conditions and the water conditions, the currents are just going to carry all that stuff away. It'll strip it away from the ground. So the light green indicates where there might be the possibility of adding more eelgrass. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to stay there. So we are undertaking at present some efforts to try to figure out, well, where is it a bad place to plant new eelgrass? Where are the places where we really think that the waves might come and wash away those any replanted eelgrass? Here's another map that people care about because locally people care about the issue of sea level rise. If sea level rises by 3 feet, some predictions suggest that within the next 50 or 100 years, sea level might rise as much as 3 feet. How much of Humboldt Bay is going to be inundated? Well, we have very detailed maps of of the depths and the level of the ground around Humboldt Bay. So here is our first effort to use some of the information that we've collected to try to guess where we think inundation might actually occur. Let me switch now to water quality monitoring. With water quality monitoring, there's actually a number of things that we measure. The national guidelines I use really has indicated what are the top priorities for making measurements in coastal areas. And that includes things like temperature, the water depth, how salty the water is, the salinity, dissolved oxygen, because the animals that live in the ocean that breathe need to have oxygen in a dissolved concentration. And then phytoplankton, which are really the microscopic algae that form the basis of the bottom of the food chain in the ocean. What you see on this map here on the right is an indication of where we have some sensors. The yellow spots here indicate where the Sea Corps program has sensors making measurements all the time. The green dot there indicates where at the Coast Guard station where a NOAA tide gauge happens to be. And the blue colored dot there indicates where the Wiyot tribe, a Native American tribe, maintains its own water quality sensor. We're combining measurements from all these locations, as well as field work from our research vessel, taking students out to sea to be able to try to understand what's actually happening in the bay. For example, here in Humboldt Bay, turbidity turns out to be a pollutant. Turbidity is sort of a measure of the muddiness of the water. Humboldt Bay is a fairly muddy bay. How muddy it is varies from time to time, and as we'll see, from place to place. If we're going to try to understand, for example, eelgrass, one of the consequences of that, or one of the conditions you want to think about is, if the bay is too muddy, that reduces the ability for plants to photosynthesize. So the muddiness of the bay will limit where you can have eelgrass to some extent because it can't grow below certain depths. So one of the issues that we're wrestling with is what controls the turbidity or the muddiness in Humboldt Bay. So we're using some of the observations from our water quality sensors to try to get a handle on this. This is a fairly complicated plot, but let me just tell you the basics here. The upper line is a measure of muddiness in one of the creeks that feed into the bay. Now, there's not a lot of freshwater input to Humboldt Bay. It's a fairly salty bay, but the creeks really do bring in some mud, so that's going to contribute to the turbidity of the bay. What you see is this is from 2 months in 2007 during wintertime, January and February. And you see some distinct pulses that occur in that top red line, indicating it rains, mud gets into the creeks, and it gets flushed out pretty quickly because it's a small watershed in these areas. You might expect that when you see mud show up in the creeks, that eventually shows up in the bay. That's the green, or the blue line down here indicates the muddiness in Humboldt Bay. The green line indicates the winds. And where you have high winds, you see the green go high, and where you see the winds relatively low, you see them stay low. In this case, you might expect that the winds might help to churn up the muds over the mudflats to help make greater turbidity. If you look then at the dark blue line, you see that, well, it's not really clear that just because you see muds in the creeks that you actually see mud in the bay. What you do sort of see, though, is that the rise and fall here of the turbidity in the bay. And that seems to be very closely timed to the rise and fall of the spring and neap tides. This lower line here indicates where you have the tides rising and falling. Roughly every 14 days, we see a spring tide. And roughly every 14 days, at least at this time of year, we seem to see an enhancement of the turbidity. So there seems to be some indication that the tides are actually helping to increase the amount of turbidity in the bay. It also turns out that the bay is more complicated than we originally thought, at least in terms of its turbidity. We were out on a cruise last year trying to make direct measurements of the turbidity and other water quality characteristics. And on the left-hand side, you see a picture of the bay from space. And the little red dot indicates where our research vessel was at the time. And we were taking pictures, basically looking to the northwest. Here's that picture of the looking to the northwest. I don't know if you could see it too well in this image, but there's a very distinct front. And I'll draw a line across here to help identify where it is. Very distinct front in the turbidity. On this side, on the eastern side of the bay, it's very muddy. It's like dark chocolate. On the western side of the bay, it's more like milk chocolate. And so there's a distinct difference here that we haven't yet accounted for. So what's going on? What's controlling the turbidity in the bay? We actually had a device that can measure the turbidity while we were moving along in the boat. What I have here is a picture, a map of Humboldt Bay, the northern part of Humboldt Bay, and we were driving around with the boat, and we were measuring turbidity continuously. And what you can see, for example, is that when we go, this is Indian Island up here, when we go north of Indian Island, the colors are cooler, indicating less turbidity. As we go south of Indian Island and Woodley Islands, you see the warmer colors. That's indicative of higher turbidity. This is all occurring on an ebb tide. The water's going out with the tide there. So we're seeing mud being dragged down from the mudflats up here in Arcata Bay. We're seeing less muddiness on the western side and more muddiness on the southern side here. So it's changing and helping us develop a model for what the turbidity is in the bay. And while I won't go into the gory details here, the upshot is that the measurements that we're making with our ocean observing systems are helping us refine what we think is going on with the turbidity in Humboldt Bay. Our next step is going to develop some computer models that can predict what the turbidity is going to be. We've realized it's much more complicated than we originally thought. We want to be able to use these tools to help develop models that will then forecast how muddy the bay is going to be and lead to good management decisions. Another use of these water quality measurements in Humboldt Bay is associated with what oyster growers do in Humboldt Bay. In the north part of Humboldt Bay, a lot of the oyster beds for commercial harvesting exist up there. And one of the things they care about for their food source for these oysters is the small phytoplankton. Well, here's some measurements. In the upper left-hand corner, it shows you measurements of chlorophyll, which is a pigment that's associated with these phytoplankton. When we have upwelling, we can see high concentrations of chlorophyll, lots of phytoplankton, and we see that showing up in Humboldt Bay. So in the early part of this graph on the upper left-hand side, you see very high values. Those are associated with the water coming in. On the lower left-hand side is what the tides are doing. When we see high tides, we see high chlorophyll at this time. That's indicating that chlorophyll is being swept in from the ocean. That's helping feed the oysters. Well, the oyster growers care about this. They'd like to know what's happening. They want to know how much food their oysters are getting. Let me switch topics and talk about another way that we're doing ocean observing systems. In this case, we're using radar systems along the coastline to try to measure and map ocean currents. Here's an example of one of these radar systems near the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco Bay. They're relatively small size radar systems, and they could produce a lot of really important data. Here in California, we've got a system that's being funded by the state government where we are establishing a network of these radar systems up and down the entire coastline. We're going to be providing hourly measurements of ocean currents from Southern California all the way up into to Northern California. In fact, it's already happening in other states. Oregon is already networked, and there's also work going on in Washington State and around the rest of the country. Who cares? Well, we're going to be able to track water pollution as it moves around. oil spills, for example. Search and rescue operations. The current maps that we'll be able to produce here will help us figure out where water and where things in water move. So with the Coast Guard hears that there's going to be some vessel that tips over and people are in the water and they try to get out there to rescue those folks, it'll help them a lot to use current measurements to say where would that boat be now 5 or 10 or 20 hours when they actually get out there. Marine transport. You'll be able to figure out whether it's better to stick close to the coastline or away from the coastline if you're trying to go north to south, south to north, because we'll be able to tell you where the currents are faster. We'll be able to tell something about fish spawning. It's also important for larval dispersal. For example, when during the breeding cycle, when the larvae of fish and other organizations, other kinds of species get released at the shoreline, where do they go? Here's an image, a relatively recent image from 2 of the radar systems in Northern California, one up at Point St. George near the Oregon border, the other at Trinidad Head, and we're showing you a map of what 2 radar systems can provide. You can see the water doesn't just flow in one direction. It's a fairly complicated situation, and this evolves over time too. So we will be able to produce maps like this every hour to help with the kind of things that I just mentioned. The last thing I wanted to mention is to talk about waves and wave hazards. Here in Humboldt County, Humboldt Bay in particular, we have some of the most dangerous waves year-round. Part of the problem is that we have a big tide that flows in and out of Humboldt Bay. We have big waves that come in year-round, and the bottom of the ocean comes up pretty dramatically here. We lose people because of wave accidents every year. So what we've developed in conjunction with the Weather Service office, forecast office here in Humboldt County, and with Humboldt State University is the very first operational prediction program that will tell you where we think waves are going to break. It's not just when they're going to break, but locations. So for example, on the left-hand side is a map predicting how big the waves are. That's determined by the color. Warmer colors are bigger waves. And the arrows indicate the directions that the waves are moving. This is for the entrance to Humboldt Bay. And the little black lines indicate places where we think there's going to be significant wave hazard. Well, I can tell you that the mariners here, the fishermen, the people who help transport goods in and out of Humboldt Bay are using this to help make decisions about where they go when they leave or come into Humboldt Bay. So we're impacting already decisions that are being made by folks. So what's left to do? There's a number of issues. We need to continue to build the infrastructure, all of these devices that we're setting up along the coastline. It doesn't mean just putting as many different things out as you can. You want to be thoughtful about what are the things that you need to measure and how you go about it. We want to be able to bridge the gap that happens between scientists like myself and the managers that want to be able to use this information. Frankly, we speak different languages, and we need to work a lot more on trying to make sure that we're providing resources that managers can need and that managers can help figure out how to use them. On the international scale, we still need to work on supporting the developing countries, which have fewer resources, frankly. Most of the measurements that we've been making so far are physical measurements. We need to be making more chemical and biological measurements. And indeed, there's a whole area of study and research and development to create more devices that can measure things that matter from biological and chemical perspective. And then we want to be able to integrate all of this information to create data products for the users, for people that can use this information. Be able to make predictions as well as nowcasts. What's happening now, what's been happening, and what's going to happen. And finally, and we've seen some evidence of this, is to continue to work on real-time operations. It's not just waves that are hazardous. There are other kind of things that we want to think about, like harmful algal blooms. So that's basically what I wanted to talk to you today about. If you want to learn more about some of these different things that's happening nationally, internationally, locally here are some web pages for you to check out. If you're interested in water quality, if you're interested in surface current maps, feel free to check out the following web pages.